Those of you who've been in my classes, happy to see you again, and I hope I don't repeat too much of what we have covered before. Given the nature of the topic, if I get a tweet that I have to listen to, it'll mean Trump has done something that completely changes what I'm saying, so we have to see where we're going. This term, drift in mastery, 105 years ago, one of our first in our country's public intellectuals, a man named Walter Lippmann, who was a very esteemed journalist and other things, he wrote a book in the fall that was published in the fall of 1914 by this title. And as we know what happened, the Guns of August in 1914, the war to end all wars broke out. And he was talking about in that book, and obviously he had written it before the war started, about how the world seemed to be drifting. And yet, certainly we had the tools to create a more stable environment that would provide growth and benefits for many. Well, as we know, it didn't happen that way. So I chose this title as these words as the subtitle of my talk, because I think we're in a somewhat comparable position. It's interesting, if you ever do look at that book, it's still available. He was very prescient. He says a lot of things that are very applicable to what's happening today. Before moving on, I will say, one of his suggestions in that, he said that business schools are doing more to create leaders who can help us move forward. I'm not sure if we've delivered on that, but Wharton, where our new dean taught for a number of years, where I taught for a number of years, as Liz pointed out, nominally the first business school in the world, they claim to be. Berkeley, believe it or not, where business is often perceived as a four-letter word, was the second business school in the world. And the sense of many at that time was that business, instead of being this Wild West, the robber barons, the late 19th century, bad things going on, they were going to be able to train professionals, individuals who had a sense of the public interest as well as private profit, that they would be willing to do things not simply to pursue wealth for its own sake, but rather to enhance society. Are we there yet? I'm not sure. Is the global economy cracking up? Is it breaking apart in many ways? Was President Trump the cause? And does it matter to any of us? Just a little bit of a background on the global economy. In nominal dollars, $85 trillion. Purchasing power parity, as you all learned from Rich Lyon's class, is a better metric of how much wealth is out there. We're looking at, what, $135 trillion. GDP, the news that you saw yesterday, the headline in the US, GDP, 3.2% in the last quarter. But there's still a lot of worries out there. Most of you are in business. I'm sure your firms, they're overwhelmed with uncertainty. We're at a real strange point with all these things going on. We'll come to this, with China, with Europe, with Trump's various protectionist policies and whatnot. And it remains unclear if we're on a path. July, if we get there without a major problem, I don't think we will have the problem, will be the longest bull market that we've had, the recovery. It'll be quite a long time. If you look at population of the 7.7 billion and counting, in the red are the so-called advanced economies. In the blue are the emerging markets. This is clearly one reason why those of you in business, it gets a little palpitation of the heart, because that's where the future is. The emerging markets, that globalization has allowed their citizens to begin to participate in the world economy. That's where future growth remains. If we look, though, at GDP, again, in nominal and purchasing power parity, in the red are the advanced economies, the blue are the emerging economies. And in this, we see the issues already. The future, and growth, for good or bad, remains the god of business, grow or die. The future is in the emerging market still to obtain that. I'll say right now, I'm an advocate of globalization. I think it's been good. It's been good for you, it's been good for me, it's been good for Haas, it's been good for America, good for the world. I want to come back, issue some caveats on that. But the size is out there. World Trade Organization at mid-February, their indicators were that things were slowing down, that the trade outlook was not good, primarily due to the Trump's policies, the problems with China. Whoops, I told him I'd do that. And again, GDP growth is slowing, but that news yesterday, 3.2%. That is uncorrected. In a couple of months, we'll get the more data will come in, and it'll probably come down a little. But let's look at that. You know, in and of itself, it's certainly something to cheer about. One of the problems I want to deal with and spend some time on, and why I think, to get ahead of myself, some of Trump's policies are not good. We have had a huge benefit in this country and the world from the so-called Bretton Woods system. The 19th century, late 18th, 19th century, was a period of almost constant warfare. Industrialization that first broke out in the English Midlands in the 1780s, where it began to replace agrarian economies. The search for resources that would fuel industrial activity, and colonialization, which was growing rapidly, created a world in which it was not a good place to be for many people. And in the so-called great powers era, it was almost constant warfare, fighting, went on and on and on. And finally, in the Great War, 1914, 10 million, primarily males, but women also were killed in that. And then World War II, which was an extension of World War I because it never ended, because the underlying problems that created World War I were not resolved. It finally ended because of the Atlantic Conference, where Churchill and Roosevelt got together in 1941 in Newfoundland, and they said, we have to do something. We have to do something about this. This is just going to be chaos forever. Out of that came the Bretton Woods Conference. Bretton Woods at the Hotel New Hampshire, a little kind of a hamlet in New Hampshire. 730 representatives from the 45 allied countries met there. And the Atlantic Charter that Churchill and Roosevelt talked about back in 1941, they said, we have to create a system so that we're not going to constantly have these wars. And out of that Bretton Woods Conference came the foundation for the modern global economy. Most of you don't have to have me to remind you that America was an intensely isolationist nation for much of its history. Going back to George Washington, his famous farewell address, America, avoid entangling alliances. We just had this break from the United Kingdom. The last thing we want to do is to get in bed with other countries. We're a new, weak startup where the Brits might come back and invade us. Hands off. And we also are blessed with something, if you look at a map, that no other country has. What's to the north of us? Nothing against Canadians, but they are not a military threat to America. To the south in Mexico, not a threat. To the east and west, giant oceans. We have a geographic isolationism that has prevented a lot of problems that other nations have. And what do we have in this country? It's unreal. It's really unfair, the amount of natural resources that the United States has. It's just overwhelming. And what's certainly happening in North Dakota and the Permian Basin with fracking, now we're becoming, we'll be the #1 oil nation. It's overwhelming natural resources. Much of that led to this isolationism. We didn't want to get involved in all the dirty linen in Europe, and we had all these resources. But finally, what Franklin D. Roosevelt, if not us, who? If not now, when? If not here, where? We broke out of that, and the quote-unquote America's greatest generation began to play the political role that economically we had had for 40, 50 years, a dominant economic power. And in that meeting, what came out of it, either directly or by extension, was the framework for the modern global economy. These various institutions that would bring reason to bear rather than having to go to war to achieve objectives. One thing Rich Lyons, our ex-dean, certainly is the expert on, in terms of currency exchange rates. We fixed exchange rates. We made the dollar replace pound sterling as a global reserve currency, but created the GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which was the predecessor to the WTO, created the IMF, created the World Bank, created the Bank of International Settlements, and partially on the political side, the United Nations, which was already moving, was pushed by that, and NATO. These organizations have stabilized the world. Let's not kid ourselves, what's happened in the Middle East, in Vietnam, and other places, but compare it to what the world had been like prior to that time. Constant warfare. The longue durée, we have had 75 years of peace, more or less, in this system. And a big part of that, of the agreements that came out of it, were to break away from the bilateral trade system that had dominated in the past and pushing what Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State under Roosevelt for a while in the 1930s, multilateral agreements. Because they said you do these bilateral agreements, beautiful treaties, you end up bullying. The major nations can use their economic might to force others to comply. That's normal, right? But it creates tension, it creates unhappiness. And you do a deal with everyone else. So, well, how come you did with that country? They get this level of tariff and we're paying more. What about this? So the idea was that in this multilateral system that the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, would bring about, the rules applied to everyone. So the bullies couldn't bully. It would be a system in which everybody would have a chance to do well. And we have to keep something in mind in all of this. I do believe that America is a unique nation. It did it for the right intentions. But who was the major ally, a major ally of the US in World War II? The Soviets. And the perception that the evil empire was there. And as much of these, the Soviets were invited to the Bretton Woods Agreement. Stalin wouldn't go. And much of what came out of it was designed to create a system to show the world democratic capitalism is superior to the totalitarian socialist program of the Soviet Union. So that clearly was a backdrop there. So we could go into the world and show nations on the brink or on the edge, our system is superior. But it worked, it did a lot of good things. So the great powers, World War I, World War II, these changes, relative peace and prosperity. But the system has broken down. It's collapsing now. Why did that system collapse? I mean, nothing lasts forever. Was it simply fatigue? Part of it was in the post-World War II era. You get tired of everything. Regulation grew, costs were higher, and a growing sense that this drift towards liberalism, this drift to the left in the economy and politics, was creating a lot of uncertainty. The 1970s, I remember that, Jeff, you don't, but the 1970s was a big economic malaise, big slowdown, lots of problems. And a growing sense that, why is this happening? And a prevailing sense that, well, maybe a lot of these regulations are getting in the way. And there were clearly a lot of regulations that didn't help growth, that stymied growth. And there was the backdrop, certainly social unrest. The Vietnam War did a lot to stimulate anger, the civil rights movement, lots of things going on. Nixon driven from office, Ford came in, All-American Center at the University of Michigan for 2 years. The good news, bad news, apparently he was a lineman, forgot to wear his helmet on game days, had a problem. Carter came in. Carter, a wonderful man, a great ex-president, but didn't get things done. And clearly when the Iran hostage crisis wiped out his presidency and maybe set the stage for a change. what had happened in the UK a few years earlier with Margaret Thatcher coming in because the Labour Party had drifted very much to the left in the UK. So we got the same thing with the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, that let's get rid of these regulations, let's focus on markets again, let's get back to business. And Reagan's famous comment, the government is not the solution, the government is the problem. And reflecting again very much traditional Republican ideology. The role of government is to balance the budget and get out of the way. Very little else. That markets are self-correcting, capitalism works. I'm overstating it obviously, but we saw that. That began to undo some of this system. And certainly the growth of globalization. When the United States began to play a more active role after World War II. Again, we wanted to show the world that our system was superior, so trade barriers were down. We freely transferred technology. We did it to Germany and Japan, the defeated nations in the war, but we didn't want them to drift into communism. Germany, the dominant economy in Europe, wiped out right next to the Soviet Union. We wanted to help them. When Mao came to power in 1949, the fear that Japan might have some problems, so we wanted to help Japan recover. And with that, we began to push technology, push products, and our markets were open. That began to happen. Globalization had happened before. Trade barriers came down. But what really stimulated at this time, technological change and transportation change, that modern technology enabled globalization. We can look in many forms of transportation, but you think of somebody like some of you, I'm sure, have heard of him, Malcolm McLean. Malcolm McLean, if you haven't heard of him, Google it, containerization. One of the great ideas that did a massive amount to stimulate trade. And as ships got bigger, these are classic Econ 101 scale. If you manufacture a car in Japan and ship it to America, average MSRP of a car in America today, all sizes, small up to the top, is around $30,000 US average. So that's merely an average. But of that, let's assume that's the number. Of that $30,000, if the car comes from Japan, how much of that is transportation costs? What does it cost to ship a car from Japan, from Osaka, say, to Long Beach or to Oakland? Any rough idea? Jeff, throw a number out. $5,000, way off. 250 bucks. It's nothing because again, the scale, you build these giant boats, you don't have to pay a toll to go over, and it brings it down. That type of effect has had a huge benefit for globalization on that. Well, with that and modern communications technology, supply chain management. You can sit in Pittsburgh or Chicago or New York or San Francisco, and you can minutely control what a factory is doing in Guangdong, what a factory is doing in Vietnam, what a factory is doing in Eastern Europe. On each unit, what's happening. So globalization really took root this time. But I'm going to come to this, globalization has not been all positive. Certainly with trade barriers down, globalization, people unhappy, especially working class America losing their jobs. And then the growing threat of terrorism made real for us in 9/11 and some of these other places has stymied a lot, or it's caused a lot of people in the world to say, the US is what's going on over there? Is this some effect of globalization? What that says, the Great Recession of 2008, when certainly American financial interests had a huge part in doing that didn't help out, began to turn things against that. It still baffles me why the Wall Street movement, Occupy Wall Street, wasn't able to play the role of the Tea Party, because the Democrats let that get away. It became Republicans who pushed on the Tea Party side, which really looked at this, said, how come the elite are getting everything? We're getting wiped out. We're losing our homes, our mortgages, but those at the top are doing very well. That began to turn a lot of people against globalization. And then certainly the growth of China, a target to whom people could point to say, this is what's doing it, cheap Chinese labor, stealing IP. The love affair with globalization began to wear thin. So did Trump destroy it? No, he certainly didn't, but he was the perfect messenger at the time to capture a lot of these growing emotions about what was wrong. And again, a media genius, I don't know if I'd use the word genius, but he clearly understands how the media works and how to control perceptions on that, his long work on his television shows and whatnot. Is he a protectionist, or is he the wily coyote and in fact supports a modified and improved free trade regime that will help America out without doing damage to the world? We have no clear sense, and as I'll, again, to get ahead of myself, I don't think he has a clear sense of what he wants. I truly don't. I think, again, as we've learned for a long time, he's a transactionalist more than a relationship type person. Of the moment, get it done. And there are various statements that he's made out there. Who's calling the shots on trade? Robert Lighthizer, who was an attorney for the steel industry, aluminum, very much caught up in fighting imports. He was on the side of American producers. He's the U.S. trade rep. This direct quote from Lighthizer, the global trading system is threatened by major economies who do not intend to open their markets to trade and participate fairly. China, contrary to the fundamental principles of the WTO. China was an original member of the GATT, but Mao dropped out in 1949. They petitioned to get back in starting in 1985, and finally, when Clinton was president, allowed them to join. The GATT transitioned into the WTO in 1997. And the perception was that Lighthizer had was China was gaming the system. It was a mistake to let them write. Peter Navarro, who professor at UC Irvine, who is the head of industrial trade policy for Trump assistant president, and he's been the get tough on policy. His most well-known book, Death by China, on that, where he says they're cheating on everything, they're out to get us, they want to take over the world, they're violating every rule. Who is calling the shots? Mnuchin, Secretary of the Treasury, certainly has been involved. A lot of people there, but at the end of the day, I think they reflect Trump's views. Trump, by the way, if you go back and you can find some of his earlier comments, in the 1980s, he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and a couple other papers criticizing Reagan's international trade policies in the early 80s, saying this is wrong, he's going to give it away. He's been of that mind for a long time, and I think even though he is an opportunist in many respects, his perception that we're getting ripped off has been real. When he was running for president, we're getting ripped off. Every nation takes advantage of us. They'll stop with me. We'll put America first. Economic national, we'll build the wall, renegotiate NAFTA, do beautiful bilateral trade deals, get out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, impose big tariffs on China, unwind international supply chains, reform tax, tweet insults. Trade wars are good and easy to win. I'm a tariff man. He's made very clear his views, but again, is this a wily coyote, brilliant negotiating ploy? Or does it reflect a perception that is weird? There are winners and losers in free trade. That's almost by definition. Globalization, the process by which the economies of the world's nation states becoming more closely integrated, trade, technology, financial flows. And there was also, sub rosa, a perception by many in America that globalization would be the vehicle to create a democratic capitalist world system, that we would not only have the economic benefits, the American system of values would be transferred to the rest of the world. People would see that. When Clinton allowed China to join the WTO, there have been lots of opposition for a long time by American politicians, because China started petitioning to join the GATT in 1985 because of religion, Falun Gong, lots of freedom of religion. We said no. Clinton allowed it in about the last year of his second term. And his view was when he said, if we allow China to join, we're going to help them grow the economy. The middle class will grow. And those individuals will themselves begin demanding more rights, more freedoms, etc. So we don't have to, China, you're being bad, you should do this, you should do that. Their own people will rise up and demand it because as they become wealthier, participate in the global economy, they'll want the freedoms that are associated with that. Proved to be a huge mistake. Didn't work. Didn't work at all. If anything, China's become more repressive since that happened. But that was the logic, is that, and part of globalization is that the world would become like us. I want to come back to that because there's a huge cultural clash in the world. And is there a common global culture? I'm not sure, and in fact, I don't think so. I'm not going to go through all of this, but what are the theoretical foundations of free trade? Trade does not have to be a zero-sum game. That was the prior view, and to a degree, I think that's part of Trump's view, is that, well, if you're winning, I must be losing. And if I'm winning, screw you. That's how it works. We began to see 202 years ago when David Ricardo created the concept of comparative advantage, which is the underlying foundation of trade theory. Incredible simplification. The Brits are good at textiles. The Portuguese are good at wine. Why are the Brits good at it? Natural factor endowments. The terroir, the skill, sheep, wool, technology, they can make garments, cotton, clothing very cheaply. The Portuguese are really good at wine, terroir, labor, skills. The Brits would like a bit of wine with dinner. Well, let's be honest, hold the dinner. Let's just have a lot of wine. Well, the UK, England, and Great Britain could make wine, but economics is about what? In a world of scarce resources, you don't want to waste. Economics is about efficiency. If the Brits were to make their own wine, they would have to spend far more per unit of output because they don't have the natural factor endowments. When the Portuguese are out stomping on grapes for their wine, they'd like to have some clothes on. They could create a textile industry, but the natural factor endowments, that's not their skill. So what's better? Why don't the Brits focus on what they do best? Why don't the Portuguese do what they do best? And voila, let's trade. Why much of trade theory is opposed to protectionism, to high taxes. Why? Because it distorts investment, leads to inefficiency. The world is better off if nations focus on their comparative advantage. And it's much more complicated than that, but that's the core of the argument. So in the aggregate, we're better off through trade. Global GDP, global standard of living, everybody's lifted up by that. Everyone's better off. And instead of this protectionism, it used to be called mercantilism, where governments would create laws and regulations and controls to protect home industries. One of the most prescient sentences in the 5 books of Adam Smith. Adam Smith had the first views on comparative advantage, but they were not quite as robust, profound as Ricardo. But in that book, in The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, which is the foundation of our modern capitalist economy, maybe the most prescient system, and I'll paraphrase. He says, whenever you see 2 or more business people quietly talking in the corner of the room, you know they're trying to fix the market to their advantage. They're trying to, because the purpose of business is what? Is to make money. What kills profit? Competition. They would much rather be in monopoly situations. Well, one of the problems we have in this type of free trade, firms are using political muscle to get benefits for their industries or their firms. We see it constantly, and we have to push back against that. But in the aggregate, the benefits are there. And the idea is that, well, if you're not doing well as a nation, then change your policies, or you're going to go under. And in a democracy, the political leadership will be voted out because they're pursuing policies that are inimical to the benefit of the nation. You look at a number of countries. Brazil was one of them, highly protectionist, made their own computers, a lot of their own stuff. Brazil was dying. They were just not doing well. When market began to open up, Brazil has done much better. Certain people will come to this, have done better, but the economy as a whole began to move up with that. And Lula, who was a labor leader, very left, uneducated, nobody ever thought he would be the person, but he began to put in those policies. Trade then, international trade is good, but, and multilateral better than others. Globalization then, lower prices for goods and services, growth stimulated, consumer income grows, jobs for millions, etc. We all know that. Whoops. But on the negative side, destroys manufacturing jobs in the wealthy countries, because when you open up markets, the level of demand for income is not the same everywhere. In that steel book that Liz mentioned, back in 1980s, I did the Dummies book is the one that sells. The steel book was a fun book. But in 1980, if an American steel worker, fully loaded, full benefits, was getting in 1980 dollars about $50 US an hour, that with pension, healthcare, all this stuff. Japan was moving up rapidly. Japan was about $40. Korea was starting to move up. Pohang Steel was maybe 25. Brazil was building a steel industry, $10, $12 an hour. China had a steel industry. 10 cents per hour in US dollar terms, currency was the hourly wage. So yeah, that in open markets, profits, the search for profit is like water. It seeks its level. It looks for the cheapest place. So a lot of manufacturing industries were relatively low skill, key term, relatively low skill, they were going to lose out to nations where workers, for whatever reasons, were willing to work for less because their level of economic development was such that those were decent enough wages. But the negatives also, fewer labor and environmental regulations in those countries. We impose those on the advanced economies. How come the others don't have to do it? That was part of the NAFTA criticism. Also, a nation will lose its economic sovereignty. They'll become banana republics. Large firms will move in much of sub-Saharan Africa, use economic might to dominate governments to win. That term banana republic, I think many of you have heard of it. The United Fruit Company based in Boston ran Central America for 20 or 30 years. Literally, on most of the 5 countries there, United Fruit determined who would be president, what the policies would be, who would be in the legislature. They were so-called democracies, but they were, banana was one of the products they made. They ran the country. So the fear, again, that globalization would concentrate power, big firms, and local citizens would lose their sense of national identity. And the worry by many, well, globalization is simply a code word for Americanization. America is going to force its consumers' habits down the throats of everybody. Everybody's going to have to wear Nikes, drink Starbucks, eat McDonald's, blah, blah, blah. Who wants that? So there were 2 sides to the argument. When we look at foreign trade in the U.S., we have to keep something in mind. Go back to what I said earlier. We have so many natural resources. It's unfair. And we have skill. The percentage of GDP of international trade, exports and imports, about 27%. The world, it's double. We've grown since that, but it still doesn't dominate the economy. Go down the bottom, Germany, almost 90% of its economy is trade. China's still at 40%, coming down. So it's not as if trade has been the lifeblood of America, because we're so big and we have a large population. And in the trade, utterly dominated by, roughly speaking, a handful of companies. If you look at corporations, partnerships, sole proprietorships, what do we have in America? 12, 13 million business entities. Look at the numbers up there. A tiny amount of firms, tiny, infinitesimal, dominates trade. And these obviously are the large companies. S&P 500, half the revenue. Coca-Cola is essentially a foreign firm. The S&P 500, 75% of its total stock market valuation, but only 17% of the workforce. They're the ones involved in it. 250 of those firms, half of our annual exports, 60% of our imports. Top 50 accounts for 30% of imports, 40%. And again, who are some of these? Exxon, Intel, Apple, GE, Boeing, some of these others. These are the large names. So it's not as if they dominate. Why aren't there more firms? SME, small, medium enterprise, Department of Commerce and others has urged American firms to get into the global economy for decades. Hasn't happened. Why? What the international management literature calls the liability of foreignness. First of all, why don't they all speak English? It'd be a lot easier. And what the hell is a meter? You know, why don't they use feet and inches like us? And what's these currencies and exchange rate and all this stuff? It's complicated to do that. You know, many of you, either from Europe, you've been there, everybody knows the value of the currencies and others because they have to. They know these other systems. We don't have to in America. So a lot of small firms, the cost of actually doing business, the transaction cost, they say, hey, not worth it. Look at the American market. Maybe the Southeast is growing. I can go there. The trade-off is greater possibility of profit with less effort. So small, medium firms have not moved into the global economy that much. So we're not as dependent on foreign trade, part of it. But if you look at the stock market, a lot of those firms, the stock market moves a lot. I'll come to this in 1 second, but much of the gyration, not only Powell at the Fed, but what's going to happen with Trump and China. The market looks good, booms. Oh, they're not doing it, it crashes. Because it's the large firms that dominate the top 30 and the big firms that are dependent on that. Who's complaining from globalization? This is a busy slide. But recent electoral outcomes, including Trump's election, this was written in 2017, including Trump's election, highlight the intensifying economic grievance of many households across the developed world. In the 20 years before the financial crisis, unprecedented globalization raised incomes for just about everyone. Incomes of the poorest third rose by 40 to 70%. Those of the middle third increased by 80. The top 1% did even better. But yet, incomes of a crucial group, the lower middle income households, barely rose at all. And since 2008, they've been the ones who feel they've lost out. And globalization became an easy catchword to signify all of their problems. And Trump played it like a brilliant violin, playing on those fears, the accumulated sense, we're getting screwed by those damn foreigners who are sending their goods in, cheap labor, et cetera. He played it brilliantly from a political perspective, playing on fear. Says more or less the same thing on this. One thing I would point out on this, though, is that in the literature, the research is fairly conclusive. Did China cause the erosion of industrial America? No. Automation was a far bigger player. And it's going to get even worse in that sense because of AI, is that firms, the purpose of the firm is to make money. They're going to look to cut costs anywhere they can. Is what economists call the substitution of capital for labor. Capital means technology. We see it consistently putting in machines that do what people used to do, huge benefits. They don't call in sick, they don't go on strike, they don't ask for raises, they'll work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and tax policy gives a huge benefit to putting in investment in factories, et cetera. So much of that, and many of you either work there themselves, you're doing startups, you've been through businesses, walk in, you don't see a lot of workers in these places. The machines do things. That had a greater effect than Chinese goods coming in and wiping out American firms. But it's easier to relate to that. It makes good stories. Oh, people lost their jobs because of Chinese imports. Some slides here, just a Lorenz curve and a Gini coefficient measures wealth distribution in a given entity. You look at population up to 100%, wealth and population. You put a 45-degree curve, that's perfect distribution. 10% of the population is 10% of the wealth, 50%, 50%. Nobody ever has that. The countries that come closest are the Scandinavian countries. They're small, high taxes, common culture, willing to share more. One of the worst ones, Brazil, is near the bottom in terms of the greatest inequality. Has globalization helped? Well, it didn't really help that much because those prior slides, the benefits in the aggregate, but a small percentage of us, and let's be honest, look around you in the room, we are the elite. We benefited from globalization. We've done very well in many respects, but it wasn't evenly spread. Interestingly, if you look at China today, the Gini coefficient, that's the US, 0.42. China is essentially the same today. When Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, one of his famous comments, China will have rich people before it's a rich country. And they've done that, but they're at the same point. China now purportedly has more billionaires than America. It's doing very well. And let's be honest, if you have money, you don't give it up easily. Yeah, you're right, there's poor people here, I'll give you 50% of my income in tax. They don't do that. They've got a looming problem in that way with a lot of very wealthy people. I'll come to that very quickly. Top 1/10 of 1%, the really tiny, we've seen it's grown dramatically. All this stuff we've read about. Manufacturing employees in the US, manufacturing is down, unionized workers are down. Manufacturing jobs as a share of all jobs, it's down. Part of that is because advanced economies are not manufacturing economies. They're service economies. What is by far the biggest quote unquote industry in America? Healthcare. Healthcare, what, pushing $4 trillion? What many say is the second biggest industry in America? What we're doing right now, education, all levels, K-12, colleges, corporate education, executive training. Those are service businesses. Services are defined creation of intangibles, not tangible products. And you think about it just for a moment, yeah, it makes sense. First, what were there? Agrarian economies, people farmed. Technology came along, they shifted to industrial economies. Hard work in the factories, many days. Many of us, certainly my parents, worked hard so their kids wouldn't have to do that type of job. We're the beneficiaries, college education, white-collar jobs, not blue-collar. Nations that move up the scale transition from agrarian to manufacturing to services. We're seeing that now. It's happening in China. The US was the first, quote, post-industrial society. By the mid-1950s, over half the workforce in America was in services. So the drop in manufacturing, it's expected in advanced economies, but certainly it was exacerbated by globalization. And then merchandise trade balance deficit, those are all negative, the green line. It has been coming down on that. But trade and services, the headline figure we always see on trade balance is manufacturing. In services, we're doing a lot better. I'll come to very quickly, because I do want to leave some time for Q&A. But the round, they're called rounds, the WTO, the GATT, the Doha Round, which it collapsed. The WTO is a mess today. It's having problems. It collapsed over services. A lot of what used to be called the southern nations, not the advanced economies, were fearful that if they opened up, Western firms, the advanced economies, would dominate totally, not only manufacturing, but services. So it's not working. But we do very well I gotta keep doing it. Maybe I'm telling myself, go fast. Offshoring to China, yes, it's grown. Globalization, automation, and education. We all know STEM majors get jobs. My kids, a lot of them, my oldest daughter has a PhD, my second oldest has a PhD here, my oldest son has 2 degrees from here, my youngest daughter went to UCSB, my wife went to UCLA. They're all unemployable because they have typical Berkeley Marxist theology jobs or something like that, or various things. None of them were STEM majors. And part of that is the problem, is that we don't push that in many ways, and we're trying to. And also, Rico Moretti, who's in the econ department here, has written brilliant stuff on labor markets. And a lot of it's the cultural attachment. As jobs move, people, lower income, blue collar, they're not going to move to Silicon Valley into an environment where they don't know people, they don't feel comfortable, they can't afford. And what happens? Those like us, you know where we want to be? Around people like us. You want to meet people, meet husbands, meet wives, meet boyfriends, girlfriends who are educated like you, the convergence to areas like the Bay Area, big cities, culture, etc. So we're seeing the rural areas are just getting worse and worse and worse. And the modern economy is a STEM economy. They're not going to go to, middle of Louisiana. They're going to go to where the workers are for the jobs. So labor mobility isn't that easy to achieve. People have deep cultural roots to where they are, and they don't want to just give up. Sad reality then, the elites have failed us in many ways, I think, the political elites. And we see this, we have this incredibly fractionated political system today. All these problems, the Middle East, all these things, national political leadership has not delivered. And Trump became the messenger for change to those who didn't pay. When he was running, Trump, nobody knows the system better than me, which is why I alone can fix it. I am your voice. I will give you what you've been looking for 50 years. I'm the only one. Playing on fear of many of those who were displaced by these broader social economic changes. And they saw him. And as you may have guessed, I voted for Hillary. She ran a terrible campaign. Even though she won a number of votes. But, going into West Virginia, hey, minors, it's over, sorry. Not going to Wisconsin, some of these took for granted. And Trump, again, a media master, played it like a virtuoso, appealing to these groups, the blue collars that had voted for Obama and others, traditional labor-leaning individual, and they abandoned her in drove. Part of it was sexism, obviously, and other factors, but it was a bad campaign. Trump made promises. He claims he's an economic nationalist. What is that? An ideology that favors state intervention and guidance by tweeting or otherwise, not necessarily regulations, but protect the interests of the country above all else. Policies emphasize domestic control of the economy, labor, capital markets, even if it requires tariffs, taxes, other restrictions. It opposes globalization or questions the benefits of unrestricted free trade. And mercantilism, import substitution, it puts in place. And Trump has claimed publicly multiple times that's who he is. The big question, and we're nearing the end here, hopefully time for some Q&A, is certainly China. The G20, forget it. The G8, no. The G7, no way. It's the G2. The relationship between the United States and the People of the Republic of China, I think, will define the 21st century, where we're going on this. And what is it that we want out of this? Does Trump want to fix the system to improve it? Because clearly China's violated a lot of it. They manipulated currency, IP, we know all that stuff. That wasn't made up. Or does he just want to destroy it? Is it a Steve Bannon blow the system up mentality and shit, let's just see what happens afterwards? Or opportunism will take advantage? I have views on that. Certainly meeting with his trade team and Mr. Liu, the chief Chinese negotiator. And the most recent news, what did Trump say at the White House 2 days ago? Well, President Xi Jinping, China, will be visiting soon, and we're going to work something out. I'll come back to this, but I think what he would love to do is stretch this out till when? A little before the election. Oh, the economy, because again, when things look good with China, the market booms. When things look bad, the market tanks on that. But working something out is there. We're going to win either way with a trade negotiations with China. This was April. Or getting a deal where we win by not getting a deal. I don't understand what that means. And I'm not sure that Trump does. But it's, again, part of how he does things. One thing I do want to mention, though, is I brought this up just in passing a moment ago. Is it a world in which we all approach it from the same platform of values? Globalization hasn't worked that way. One thing I've found, and as Liz pointed out, I teach in a lot of places in Asia and Europe and travel a lot like many of you. I don't care how many lectures you go to, books you read, videos you watch, you don't know until you're there. You really don't know little things that really drive. Oh, people will never buy that color. Geez, I didn't know that. That color, no, nobody buys that. It's interesting, in America, for example, men don't like to wear yellow sweaters, yellow clothes. Why? Oh, yellow, you're a coward. It comes from that. Now, who would have known that? Maybe, so I find when you actually get to a place, you begin to see what really goes on. There are very real cultural differences. There are cultural differences in China. We should keep in mind, and certainly the Chinese remind us, the century of humiliation. Starting in the mid-19th century, China, there's an historian at Cambridge, has a very interesting new book out, came out just a couple of weeks ago. He said, the rise of the West, this is the anomaly. He says, look at 5,000 years of history. China and India, the large nations, dominated. It was this weird little blip, the Industrial Revolution. We're reverting back to the mean now. We're going back to these nations that have dominated the world for most of modern world history are coming back to that. But in those nations, they are not, and this is maybe the conceit of our dominance over the last 100 years or whatever, is that, well, our values must be the best values. That's what everybody wants. Not necessarily. The sense of, certainly in China, the Shi Dada, as he's sometimes called, the uncle, the dad, the powerful man. We see that in many countries. The individual who will create stability. When I teach in Asia, and I teach a lot there, I have to admit, I'm very impressed with family structures. Family structures are so dominant there. And they're family structures in which there's a hierarchy. It is male-dominated, but older people are respected. The kids there, the family, they say things. There's something there about control that they like. We believe in markets. You go out, you do what you want, you win, you lose. It's a different value system. And keep something else in mind. China still is dominated by the Chinese Communist Party. What was the margin of victory in Xi's last election? Whoops, I forgot something. There's no election. It is the only legitimacy of that party is what? The economy will grow. The social contract that the party made with the people. Don't mess with us. We run the country. You'll be better off economically. Xi has to keep the economy growing or they're in trouble. And you see little issues of this when problems happen. It's a different cultural background that we have. One of the examples I use, when a guy, E.T. Hall, first wrote about this a long time ago, and many of you in the audience, women, his wife did most of the research and writing. He put his name on the book. But supposing, Jeff, we're in the US, we are negotiating some deal, put your hand out, we do a deal. What does this mean in the US? Nothing, unless it's in a contract that can be adjudicated in a court of law. In much of the rest of the world, it'll happen. We've made a deal. This is going to happen. That's a cultural difference. We are, oh no, handshake? Are you kidding, you idiot? You thought just because we shook hands? In fact, read a lot of the stuff with Trump. What has he done? Gone back? No, just because I told you I was going to give you $2 million, you idiot, you thought I would actually give you that? I'm giving you $25,000, take it or leave it. In that sense, we have a different value system than other parts of the world in many respects. And part of the problems we're having with China, it's a clash of cultures. Xi Jinping is a headstrong, powerful individual who needs victories as well. Donald Trump is a headstrong, powerful individual who needs victories. That gets messy when you have that type of negotiation. So, short-term issues to watch. Late April, is Xi Jinping going to visit? Is it next month now? They're talking in May, maybe June. But whenever it looks good, the market goes. They both want victories. USMCA sounds like a military branch, is the new NAFTA. That thing on December 2nd, Congress said it. By law, you have 6 months. The president put it in on December 2nd last year. By law, Congress says you have to do it within 6 months. And the Democrats are not doing that because problem, and auto tariffs with the EU, big issue. Trump wants a victory. Democrats want to stymie him regardless. We're seeing that. They don't want him to have any victories. In my own sense, he doesn't have a real vision of MAGA and whatnot. I think he's trying to return to a mythical 1950s, Make America Great Again, Make America White Again, or sort of thing. It just isn't going to happen. The 50s are over. but he's appealing emotionally in a way that people respond to. I don't see a real vision of what he wants to do other than one-off, transactional, oh, I won, we have a victory, I'm a good president. I will say, though, right now, and we can talk about this till I'm done in 1 second here, Sarah, but if there were election today, I think he'd win. I think he'd win today. You know, the Democrats are playing the usual circular area, let's all shoot each other. We'll see what happens on that. I will, again, those are my views. That you have your own views, you should have them. But the opposition and the conclusions. Globalization, I think, has been positive for the global economy and prosperity, but the benefits have not been evenly distributed. Some nations have unfairly gamed the system. China clearly has done that in terms of IP especially. It should not go on. But I think reform, not destruction, is what we need. And it involved, the WTO isn't working well. Part of it Trump is exacerbating. The WTO is actually run by arbitration hearings. And the US is vetoing everybody. There are essentially no judges left because Trump will not allow anybody to become a judge. They're pushing it out. So they have no people to do anything. But since the Doha Round, where it got stuck, there's been no progress. The foundation is collapsing. And I think Trump has pushed for more destruction without having any clear, well thought out recommendations in place. And again, I go back, is he a protectionist? Does he have a sense that the global economy is good, that we all benefit? The distribution of benefits have to be changed. So are we one world or just a collection of individual countries? And where is the global leadership when we need it? It's hard to find a time in modern history when the issues have been this profound and leadership has been weak everywhere. I don't see a global leader out there. How long will she last? She's on her way out. I like her. He's got his issues. Who knows what's going on? I put the crown on the president for life, the new Brazilian who's a Trumpist, and we've got there's about a 10-year election cycle it takes in India to get somebody elected, but that's going on now. Where is the leadership that's going to say, we need to fix this system and make it work? I don't see it out there, and I don't think that's good for any of us. So I think you need to reach your own conclusions. There's a lot of data out there, but hopefully reason rather than emotion will drive what we come up with. And we go back to that book, Drift and Mastery by Walter Lippmann. Again, times have changed, but Lippmann believed in science. He believed in facts, and he thought the world was drifting because we were getting into this, people were being emotional. They weren't using reasoned logic, turning to information, trying to provide solutions that were going to be good. And maybe that's the way life is. What do we do next? I've got a clue. Come on up here. Yeah, if you do have a question, come up to a microphone now so we don't waste time. Good to see you again, by the way. And
you're
not,
it's always great to see you.
I'm not changing your grade either. But go ahead.
You don't have to.
That's right. And same with Liz. Go ahead. Yep.
So this is what I do, the emotion and reason. I help people stay within reason and fact and data. And I get calls from people worried about tribal entropy, Trump breaking the world, civil war, just crazy stuff. And I look at the next 2 years because that's really the only thing we have clarity on in terms of making investment decisions. And I don't see much risk in the next 2 years. The trade issues are not big enough to cause a recession, you know, but there's still a lot can happen. I'm more concerned about the next 10 years. I think that Trump policy has damaged NATO. We're seeing a rearmament of the world because countries don't trust NATO anymore because of Trump. We're seeing made in China, so our technological sort of superiority is likely to be lessened in the future because countries don't want to rely on US exports so much, particularly China. And I have concerns about the dollar as the foreign reserve currency because other nations can no longer trust that the US is a stable government and a stable country because of Trump policy. The idea of him being reelected again scares the crap out of me. And I don't want to be in a dark place. So do you see an opportunistic path forward? I mean, Where do we go from here?
Okay. Victor, that was my question for you. But Victor, you brought up a lot of good issues. I'm sure many of your colleagues in the audience were thinking of some of those. A couple of things you brought up, though. One, again, if we look at, go back to this cultural issue you brought up, one of the things I think we've come to realize, certainly with Trump and others, nationalism is a much more powerful force than many of us want to realize. You know, at the end of the day, oh, I'm a citizen in the world. We'll jump in the hot tub and kumbaya, and we're all brothers and sisters under the skin. We find that there's a very strong identity with local areas. One way to get your nose broken, for example, go to Munich and say, oh, you're a German. Boom, I'm not a German, I'm a Bavarian, and don't you ever forget it. That sense that they go to parts of England, oh, you're English. I'm not English, I'm British, I'm not English. Scotch or Welsh or something, that sense of identity is very powerful in who we are. And that's part of, again, is it rational? No, but that's who we are. I've always pointed out in my global class, some of you might remember, we've all agreed on numeracy. It's a decimal system. It makes life so much more efficient and easy. Yet how come we don't have a single language, maybe Esperanto? English is de facto, but we don't do it because that's too close to who we are. That's identity, that's culture, that's who I am. I'm not giving that up. That's one issue that has exacerbated this. I do think, you know, Trump, you have to judge people on their entirety. I really think that. You look at like Luke Walton, I like basketball, the coach at Sacramento has some problems. Biden had, but you have to look at it. I weigh it all. The economy has done well, but I don't think it's sustainable over time. I agree, Vic. You know, we're not going to have a recession because we are not that dependent. And there's still a lot of life out there. And the tax cut gave a big bump, but it's still there. And we're all doing better off because of it. Consumption is up again, personal consumption. And keep in mind, in the American economy, the US economy, personal consumption drives it. It's 70% plus of GDP is what, and where does personal consumption from? Oh, the economy is going to do well. I'm not going to lose my job. I can go out and buy stuff. And what Powell did in December, Powell, it was maybe a learning curve effect. He's the head of the Fed, replaced Janet Yellen, who never should have been replaced. But he made those dumb comments. The market dropped massively. And then he had to walk them back. And a lot of it, I think, was just not slip of the tongue. He just didn't understand yet the implication of his words. And certainly the pressure that Trump is putting on him, putting in 999, who dropped out, putting in Stephen Moore, who basically incompetent as a member of the Fed. So those are some issues on that. And the world is losing, what the hell is going on? I weigh it all up. And again, my opinion, they're nothing more than mine. You should have your own. I see the damage to America as much greater over time and even short term. America is not just a physical place, it's a concept. It's a concept to the world. And let me go back to the Bretton Woods system. Yeah, we paid a price, but we benefited, and the world was better off. We rose to the leadership to create the system that stabilized the world for so many people. We're better off from that. Is that you go before that, our kids, if we were living 100 years ago, geez, I wonder what war they're going to be in. I wonder if they're going to be killed fighting. That was resolved by people using, relatively speaking, rational means to try to resolve issues. The UN is far from perfect, but it provided a forum. The idea, let's talk about this. Let's not just immediately go for the gun and start shooting. That isn't reparable, Vic. Can we overcome some of the negatives of Trump? Yeah, you read some of the pundits, they said it's broken forever. I don't know, I may be more optimistic. The one joy of getting old, it's not going to be my problem, but maybe my kids will worry about it. Maybe my kids will worry about it. Another question, anybody have? Yes, microphone up there. Good question.
Fall off my chair. So this is more of a Chinese economy question. So in the last year, I've been to, I think, 12 cities in China, and every one of them has
in where?
In China.
Oh, yeah.
And it sounds like you've been in Asia a lot. And almost every one of the cities has loads of towering, skyscrapers that are being built, but they're all empty. And then we hear that there's, I think it was either 4 or 6% growth there this last year. how much of that is fake? And how do they keep on sustaining this growth when it literally seems like everything, I see factories being built and a lot of them are getting loans at ridiculously low amounts of, I just don't know how they can sustain it and how that will have a ripple effect on us as we continue to try to grow.
A good question, and clearly, again, the China relationship. I teach every summer in China, I've done for the last 5 years. Have any of you been to Chengdu? Yeah, many of you, have any of you never heard of Chengdu? Yeah, it's your basic little Chinese city of 19 million people. And it's not the biggest city in the province that it's in. Chongqing is bigger. Only in China would I have that. I've been teaching in Beijing the last few years. The point you made, the caveat, is so true about the numbers. You can't trust the data from China. It's been politicized. Part of it is still developing mechanisms to get it right, but also it's political. Much of the corruption that we've seen in China is at the local level. You're judged on creating economic development in your area. And if you don't do it, you don't move up. And individuals will cook the books in order to do that. They don't want to incur the wrath of senior people. I remember Hainan used to be an airline until they branched out. They're having a lot of problems now. Hainan Airlines was the fastest growing airline in China for about 6 years. There was one problem. Hainan Airlines was never licensed as an airline. An entrepreneur went to the local in Hainan, the island, said, let's start an airline. And look, okay, fine, let's do it. Nobody got approval. Nobody went to Beijing, the comparable groups. It became one of the biggest airlines. It was not an official airline. You see a lot of stuff like that. So what is real? Last December, a guy who, he gave a talk at Renmin University. He was the chief economist at ABC. ABC is the agricultural bank of China. There are 4 big banks in China. It's one of those, the last one to do an IPO. He said the growth rate in the last quarter of 2018 was 1.2%. What? Because the official, we've had problems, so we're downgrading from 6.6 to 6.5. He said it was 1.2%. The video has been deleted. He is not allowed to speak anywhere. You can't find literally any reference. Now, again, I don't know his source of data, but you see that. The one reason why Xi Jinping is coming back to the table to talk is that the economy has been hurt. So a lot of issues on that. I want to get in one last question when you do the final. Hi there, young lady.
Maura O'Neill.
How are you?
Good. When I taught some Chinese executives who came over here, on Friday afternoon they were debriefing their week in Silicon Valley. And they had one of the most interesting conversations I got to be a fly on the wall for 2 hours on, where half of them were saying it's okay for us as an emerging nation to continue to steal all the IP. And we're worried that we don't understand why all these Silicon Valley companies don't want to do business with us. Oh, really? But the other half of them said, the reason why Silicon Valley in America has been so successful is they have actually respected IP, and it's now time for us as a nation to step up and do that. So what sense do you have on these IP issues? Because clearly I witnessed this fierce debate among these executives on this issue, on whether the populace, the elite populace, who will ultimately make the decision in China, is actually shifting, and we will see more respect or not on IP in China?
Now, that's a great question. You were in the 3rd EMBA class.
Yeah.
Number 3.
Number 2.
The star students in there. Good to see you again. First of all, your first point goes back to what I brought up on my comments in responding to Victor. It's cultural. It's cultural. Again, you read a lot of these comments like, what do you mean? You can own IP? The stories and how much of it is self-serving, well, in a Confucian world, nobody can own IP. That shouldn't be right. And one of the views you often hear in China, well, that company's, look, they're doing that and everybody loves it, so I'm going to do it too, because that's what people want. No, they copyright, they patent, you can't do it. But look, people like it. I want to do it too. There's simply no, I'm overstating, but in many, there's no perception. IP, intellectual property, no, it doesn't exist. Right now, patent laws in America are in chaos because our patent laws, supposing I created this, I built it, or did it at the office, 9 to 5. Who owns it? The company owns the rights to it. I can patent it, I control it. We're in a service economy. Those of you, many of you have had strategy classes. The example I've always used, Michael Porter, the 5-force field. He's made tens of millions of dollars. He sat in his office at Harvard University, came up with that, had Harvard staff, typed it, all this stuff. Who owns that? Michael Porter claims he does. He doesn't give Harvard a penny. And yet, if you were to do this in your office at work, your company owns it. Services have created a huge conundrum. What is intellectual? Who owns it? How do you control it? We haven't worked it all out yet. But much of the cultural perception in China is that, well, you can't own intellectual property. And what I've heard, I'm not an expert on it, what I've heard is that it goes back to a Confucian logic, that it belongs to the people, it's out there, and there should be nothing wrong with leveraging yourself. If it works, people like it, go for it. And that, I'll end it on that, because we're out of time. But what does it come back to again? A global economy assumes global standards and global rules. I just did a paper with a colleague. It's going to be in the Fordham International Journal of Law. And it's on part of the WTO primarily. But if you want a global system, you need global standards. You need global rules. Otherwise, there's no system. And one of the things I did focus on that, and I want to focus more on it later, is there a global culture? I brought it before. I don't think there is. And so you're going to either have to have mechanisms to arbitrate when these differences come up, or you're going to have the whole world converge on who's ever in power's view of what the world is like. This is what we thought globalization would do. Not only economic benefits, the world would turn into, I love democracy, I love capitalism, blah, blah, blah. I love private property. It hasn't worked that way in many respects because culturally. And maybe, is it the conceit of power? Well, we're America, damn it, so our views must be right. And again, the more you go abroad and you travel, you find not everybody has our belief system. And I don't know if, it's not my job or my role or my privilege to say, you must behave like I do. My values are more important. And this is the last thing on it. Whenever I say last thing, we're in 20 minutes. But when I usually in the class, and some of you have had, name me values that you think are global values appropriate at any place, any time. You quickly start running up, geez, you know, what are the values that I would be willing to really fight for? The one I always come up with, well, I don't like the way you look. I'm going to get out a gun and shoot you. Nobody would agree to that, I think. Nobody would agree that you can take another person's life on a whim, just your own. But what about women in the workforce? Is that a global value? Should we fight for it? Or should local cultures define the role of women in the workforce? What about child labor? Then in many parts of the country, of the world, child labor's there, poor families, whatever. Should we say, oh, no, a child is entitled to childhood, and it is illegal, it should be punished in any ways if children are working? I get different views on that, especially when I'm in emerging markets. Then I ask the next question. Okay, if children, okay, what about children in the sex trade? Where do you draw a line then? If child labor, do you? So you begin to, and you can ask yourself a lot of these questions. What are the real global standards and values that as members of the great chain of humanity, we all agree, yeah, these should be for everyone. You quickly begin to realize, you know, I'm different than you. Your views, and why should my views prevail? Is it, what was Mao's famous comment? Where does power come from? The end of a rifle. And is that maybe we have dominated, and ending this honestly, Sarah, ending it, is the American century over? The short 100 years. The US utterly, completely dominated the 20th century. And Henry Luce, the co-founder of the Time Life Publishing Empire, wrote a famous essay in 1941 in which he coined that term. But some of you remember from the prior lectures, modern history, 16th century Spain didn't hold it. 17th century Holland didn't hold it. 18th century France didn't hold it. 19th century the UK, greatest empire in history, didn't hold it. Life moves on. It's been a good ride. 20th century, forget it. And maybe advice to your children, learn Mandarin. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.